Hello and welcome to Elden Kings and Elden Ring discussion. I am your host, Gideon the Half-Knowing, and joining me this evening is Rage Akari. Say hi, Rage.
Hi, Rage. I'm sorry I had to do that. Hi, everybody. I'm Rage from the channel Rage Akari. Tend to be a little bit more absent and then drop a random lore video that is pretty out of the wall. Resident Mikola obsessor, as you do. But yeah, that's me.
I mean, it's the most kingly way to produce YouTube videos. Like, drop something random every now and again and then have no other presence besides that.
Exactly. Yeah, you just got to do it.
And I mean, according to the lore, Gideon's a Mikola obsessor too, so I guess I am
True.
automatically right there with you.
That is correct. Yeah. Oh,
Well, I mean, honestly, we've had quite the journey with Elden Ring, and Gideon included. We've had
yeah.
over, yeah, we've had over 2 years of challenge runs, theory crafting, fan works, and more. Plus, whatever From Software has in store for us. It tallies up to quite the pile to pick through for details. With all that said, we really have to address the core of what is on everyone's mind as the DLC approaches, which is, what do we even know so far about Elden Ring?
It's like simultaneously way too much and way too little. Like at this point, I think like between the two of us, we've written about like 3 or 4 different books worth of stuff that just like it's hard because like also a lot of the stuff in Elden Ring that we know of is so interconnected that like we're doing this now, right, to try and get through as much of it as possible, explain all of it before the DLC, or probably as the DLC starts, and then the same thing is going to happen once the DLC comes out. We're going to have to go through everything. But because everything's so interconnected, a lot of the stuff that, at the very least, I know, like I've written, just cascades. It just spirals into. So we're going to talk about Mikola, and now we're going to talk about the Haley tree, and then we're going to talk about trees. Oh, we're going to talk about the Erdtree. Now we're going to talk about the Shadow tree, and then like all of that, and it gets to quite a lot. So yeah, a lot.
And that's not even when people start browbeating you about Yggdrasil and the Axis Mundi. Like,
Yup.
yeah. No, it's a rabbit hole to be certain, and it's one of those games where like just everything's interconnected. There's no single lore thread that you can pull on without having the entire tapestry unfold on you. So it takes a lot to try and fully understand the game.
Exactly.
Yeah. But that's what we're gonna try and do.
Hell yeah! I hope you enjoy the next several hours between this and whatever else we put out. Um,
Yeah, for real. To break down our method going forward, I'd like to start at the very beginning with Elden Ring's announcement trailer, which was, over 2 years ago now. And with that, we can work our way up to what we know now. This way, we'll hit every topical detail that From Software themselves thought was important enough to share with us prior to release. This is stuff that they really focus on in the early trailers, stuff like the Erdtree, like Ronnie, like Godwin. And maybe we can figure out some of how those plot threads were developed in Elden Ring and how they might continue to develop in the DLC. That way we can try and get everything as holistically as possible, even though we're probably gonna miss a ton of stuff and then get even more things wrong. So
yup.
mhm.
Like just as like an anecdote onto how like chaotic this is going to be just from the very start. I was recently doing some research into stuff that was like during the very early release trailers as well. And the Bandai Namco website had a article on it that said that we were going to fight alongside Radahn, and we were going to fight alongside Melania the Severed.
Did it really?
It did.
How old
And
is
there are
that
articles.
article?
This was 2021. I think I couldn't find the original article, but I found several articles referring to it and had screenshots of it. So, take it all with like a pretty hefty bucket full of salt, considering that like I'd probably have to way back machine it to find the original one. But like those articles were from 2021. So before the game released, even Bandai were like, yeah, like you guys are gonna fight, like you're gonna be besties with Radahn and Melania. And they did like at that point, Melania was still even being called Melania the Severed.
Yeah, instead of Blade of Mikola.
Yeah.
That's crazy. That's wild. I mean, like, everyone's always making those memes about what if we could team up with Millennia, so
Mhm.
that's interesting. The Radahn one actually speaks to me because, like, with the DLC, if it is the afterlife, which less people are talking about the afterlife theories now than they were
Mhm.
before, but some of them still have a little bit of fruit. If it is the afterlife, maybe we could team up with Radahn's soul. Ooh.
Mm. And to be honest, even if it isn't the afterlife per se, those are going to start cascading very quickly. So we'll move off this sooner rather than later. But even if it isn't the afterlife, there's still possibility that Radahn's soul was like lost to the Shadowlands while he was rotting. So his soul could have been severed while his body was still doing what it was doing, right? Um,
Ooh, that'd be similar
so
to Vike and his average IL.
it would, yes. Which was honestly exactly what I was thinking when I was thinking about. Um, and yeah, I mean, there's so much to get into, so I guess we just gotta start.
Well, let's start at the beginning then. Elden Ring, O Elden Ring, gold commandeth the very stars. What does that mean to you?
Um, well, the thing is, right, it means like 4 or 5 different things, just that sentence alone. Where like just as like an assertion from like Marika and the Golden Order, them saying our gold is what commands the stars. Is like the first thing. The second thing is then we start talking about Amber Starlight and how Starlight mentions that the stars hold everybody's fate, including the fate of the demigods and perhaps even the gods, right? So Amber being like tree sap, but also has a very golden hue, could literally be an assertion of like the Amber Starlight holds the stars and therefore fate. But then also we talk about the Elden Beast and how the Elden Beast was a golden star that came down. And so it's like folded in on itself like 4 or 5 different times. And I think that's oh
It is, it's very incredible. Um, the way the dialogue is delivered, the way it expresses so many themes at once is very impressive. I really like the way that as you learn, like, there's so much lore to be received in these trailers based off of knowledge of the proper nouns that they not even proper nouns, but just knowing the language that the game uses. Like
yeah.
knowing that gold indicates amber, indicates immortality, indicates the power of of the golden order as
Mhm.
you expressed it is very important. And then you also have the amber starlight as well. Uh and then having stars which represent, like what's the crystal stuff at the Raya Lucaria? I shouldn't be glintstone. There we
Bloodstone.
go.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, stars represent glintstone and they represent fate and they represent sorcery. So
Mhm.
it really does hammer in this dichotomy of gold commands fate. And I feel like if you take it further where like the amber starlight is only for the fate of the demigods and the starlight
Mhm.
is only for the fate of man, then you have this idea of the demigods supersede man, which
Mhm.
works within Korhen's description of the Golden Order, which describes as man being subservient to the gods, I feel
Mhm.
like.
And I think like even goes even further when you begin to like see how if you consider well in real life the sun is a star, right? But we don't necessarily know if we can consider that the case in Elden Ring. But the sun does exist, but it is literally outshone by the Erdtree, which is like the pinnacle Golden Order like propaganda machine, I suppose, by itself. But also it is literally just a way of like the Erdtree outshines the sun. And it
Yeah,
does command like it commands everybody's awe and vision in the lands between because at any point if you're looking up even during the night any amount of light you're getting out in the lands between is from the Erd tree.
it's an
um
ever-present reminder of their power and control.
yeah,
hmm
exactly.
And on top of that, like, even just the metaphor of, all the stars exert their control during the night, but the sun brings them to heal during daytime. You don't see any
Mhm.
stars, you only see the sun. That's the only path, as opposed to them. Yeah.
100%. And like it goes even further when like you begin to consider like the like Noxtella and Nocron and how like they're trapped beneath the earth in a false starless sky, right? where like it's beautiful and pretty, but they aren't meant to be like real stars or anything, and like it's almost twofold of not only are they trapped without the Erdtree's golden light, but they're trapped without actual starlight, and you can see very quickly also how like things begin to devolve, and like the thread keeps getting pulled further and further, and how interconnected all of this stuff is. Um, and like it's very explicit in a lot of the narration that like what they say at any point is true to some extent, but also simultaneously there's like every single sentence said in the narration tends to have like a double or even triple meaning.
Yeah. Elden Ring is very two-faced after all.
Hmm.
Before we unravel the entire tapestry, I think we might want to move on though.
Yep.
So the next bullet point is look up at the sky. It burns. So this one I feel like gets more into the intrinsic metaphysical link between the Erdtree and the Crucible and
Hmm.
the Elden Ring. When you hear Godfrey say, "Look up at the sky, it burns," this to me probably most clearly associates itself to that point in the game where you actually burn the Erdtree. But obviously that comes before everything chronologically. So the other thing that it could be referencing is the shattering itself. If you look
Hmm.
at the intro art, the one of the cards shows the shattering, and it looks like a large explosion from the Erdtree. It lights up the night sky. It's very intense.
Hmm.
And if you were to take it one step further, the Wrath of Gold, as an incantation, its description, well, first of all, its power is to cause a shockwave around you, pushing everything back. The
Yeah.
description says that this is a spell that was learned by the people of the Lands Between after the Shattering, and that it was an expression of the Erdtree's wrath. If you were to take everything just one step further with the Shattering itself, you could assume that the Erdtree, after the Shattering, sent out a shockwave earthquake that caused some of the jagged, rocky landscape that we know about the Lands Between, how ruined it is.
Yeah.
Of course, here I go unraveling the tapestry again. What did you
Yeah.
think about the sky burning, Rage?
I think like it's both interesting from like that point of view of thinking about it when it comes to the shattering itself, but then also thinking about like going down a completely different route for a second. The idea of the candle tree that kind of shows up, and then the cardinal sin of burning the Erd tree, right? Because like Enya very like is actually surprisingly supportive when you mention that you're going to burn the Erd tree. At first, she's like, "Huh? You're burning the Erd tree? What's going on?" And then she goes on to say, "A cardinal sin like can't be cardinal forever, right? Like
Yeah,
like those kind of sins are like at a certain point there's a possibility of them not being the be all end all cutting from grace." Um,
rules are made to be broken.
Exactly. But like I think the interesting thing there is then there's also that possibility that like the burning of a tree was in the idea of the candle tree, either something that was um like people had thoughts of doing beforehand in like a way of dealing with the Erd tree in the first place, which I think is less likely. Or it either happened before, or I think even more likely, um now that we have some stuff about the DLC released, obviously this could change once we know stuff about the DLC. It could be an expression of people having ideas of what Mesmer originally was intended to do, like what he intended to do after things like his potential conquest, or something to do with the Shadow Tree in and of itself. Um, because it's not impossible for those ideas to have just sprouted by themselves, but in the way that they kind of come about, the ideas of them, like of the Erd tree burning, in a like, and the fact that Enya kind of already knows how to do it before like anything else. Like you go talk to her, and she goes, "Oh, you need to get in. You need to burn the impenetrable thorns. Oh yeah, you just go up to the Giant's Forge, and then like that will work, right?" Like it's a thing that like Enya's not dumb, right? But at the same time, it's like an idea that was already somewhat seeded, which I think is interesting.
I mean, if you look at all of the background events around the burning of the Erdtree, there's the entire prophecy around it. The two fingers prophesied the return of the tarnished and the rise of one of them as Lord. They Many prophets across the lands between have also seen this and been exiled or banished for it, or even people outside of the lands between who just pray to the Two Fingers Church. They still have that whole exiling people for seeing the Erde Tree burning, because
Yeah,
the Erde Tree faith does expand beyond the lands between, even if they can't see the Erde Tree. I think that's one of the important parts of the cosmology that's similar to Dark Souls 1's Way of White, which is sometimes forgotten because we focus on the lands between so much.
yeah.
But like, speaking of the prophecy, I absolutely agree. Like, what does the candle tree like? We always saw the candle tree, like the candle tree shield, and the prophecy of the seven flames and what that meant. And
Mhm,
maybe we could relate those to the divine towers. Maybe we could relate them to something else. And of course, we can relate them to the burning of the Erde tree. But since
mhm.
this has been a prophecy that existed for a while, and given the knowledge of the DLC and what we know about it now, and especially given how all of the DLC promotional media focuses on using the phrase Mesmer's flame so much, there's
Mhm.
definitely possible connections here. I'm especially interested by Mesmer's flame, but maybe that's getting ahead of ourselves.
No, I am also very interested in it, but again, yeah, I think it's probably better we talk about some of the other flames first, because like I think the funny and almost the really interesting thing about Elden Ring is that flame is like ever present in Elden Ring. It
It's the
is one of
source of
those.
all life.
It is the source of all life, and it's the source of many, many horrible, terrible deaths. But the interesting thing about it, I think, is the fact that like the idea of flame kind of encompasses a bunch of different types of flame that all have like had their ebbs and flows of strength, right? And like the reason I like explain it like that is because we have like the godskins, like their black flame, like the like the white death flame. Sorry. There's the ghost flame, and then there's also the Godskin's black flame, and then there's also the destined death flame. And all of these different ones have had like different like points where they had strength, and even the Godskin's flames has like very explicitly been told to us that it had a lot more strength until destined death was sealed away. Um, which like the idea of all of these different flames existing and then these prophecies of the Erdtree burning potentially, or the seven flames being a thing existing as well, I think is like really really interesting, especially since like flames in real life are actually like the ideas of wildfires and forests like regrowing after wildfires is a pretty it's a pretty common thing for trees to do. Like if I remember correctly, the I think it's sequoia trees, like the redwood trees, their seeds like have a resin around them where unless the resin is burnt away, the tree like the seeds themselves are basically entirely inert. Um, and there are eucalyptus trees that when they're burnt away, if any of it remains, the what remains will go into like a hyper state of growth to regrow during that time, because it knows that a wildfire would have occurred and just burnt through all of the other trees. Um, so it is interesting, like the fear of the Erdtree burning existing, but also this like real world idea that like these flames are like actually just life, and they allow new life to be formed, not just not only a regrowth of the old, but a birth of the new.
And that idea of rebirth and renewal is like perfectly encapsulated in the end game sequence of Elden Ring, where after defeating Malekith and unleashing Destined Death, you see the Erde Tree burn, and you see everyone's like awe-struck faces of despair at seeing this happen. But when you get to Ashen Leyndell, you meet the ghost, and the ghost looks up like basically in awe of the Erde Tree because it's on fire, but it still stands tall. Like it burns, but it lives, which is something that many people didn't expect. They thought that if its immortality was removed, it would simply burn to death, but it stands mindless of the scorch of ruin or something is what he says.
Mm.
And that's really fitting because like if the scorch only took away the overgrowth of the Erdtree, which is represented by like the stagnant royalty or the dormant aristocracy and all of that classical Soulsborne stuff, and you really do see actual renewal in the process,
Mhm.
amidst the destruction.
And I think that's like also really indicative to real life to a certain point, where uh like dried dead wood burns really well. Like dry wood itself burns really well, whereas like growing living wood actually has some resistance to flame at least for a little while,
Mm-hmm.
because you actually have to like basically burn out all of the moisture first before you can burn it. So burning away the Erdtree's like dead wood, the wood that's um like been there because it's been stagnant for too long, actually is functionally just pruning it and allowing it to healthily regrow so long as the fire doesn't go too far. Which the Erdtree's permanently on fire once we do it, so maybe it will go too far, but it seems like to some extent it's still there, and it depends, I suppose, also on what ending we choose as to which the Erdtree will continue and how it will continue.
Not to
Um,
mention the possibility of a gameplay conceit. Like, in the lore, who knows how long the Erdtree could just burn for, even if the player needs all the time they can to crush their head against Radabeast, you know?
yeah.
Um, but yeah, I agree. It's very interesting. And not to spend too much time on the topic of flames, but we have a lot of other content to cover. So why don't we talk about the newly christened Elden Lord who rises after burning the Erdtree? The player character, I usually refer to them as like the player tarnished for easy, yeah.
Mhm.
They're said to be a descendant of the Tarnished. This is confirmed in a lot of promotional media going around Elden Ring beforehand. And what we know of the Tarnished is that, exiled class of warriors who left the lands between. Upon leaving, they settled new lands, started new kingdoms. If you look at Roderica or Dialos, they're both from noble bloodlines that were started by these Tarnished.
Mhm.
And the Tarnished spread the religion of the Two Fingers with them. With that religion came the prophecy that they'd have to return one day. So you see from the beginning of the game, everything is set up that way. Everyone by now knows about Queen Marika's plot to use Godfrey, discard him, and then have him return so that the Tarnished could become Lord. And, we see that that's going on even as far back as all of this happening, because obviously they set up the Two Fingers to leave with their religion.
Mhm.
Um,
And I think like there's an interesting thing there that I just want to like pull on for a second. I think it's really interesting the idea of like religion in this sense where like creating a artificial absence of like benefits, I guess, from the religion, or like a like of something similar like that, where basically what Marika did in that sense is she said you're not like not a part of this religion, but you're not like allowed to be here anymore. So go and kind of like backhandedly spread this religion to other people, spread it across the lands that you go to. Um, and then like you're gonna have to come back eventually, and you need the strength for when you come back. So instead of it just being a case of like, nah, I don't like you guys, be gone, it was a lot more of a you are useless to me right now in this sense. Go become stronger and then come back with all of the stuff that you've done. But during that time, she doesn't actually like she tells them to leave, but she doesn't entirely cut them off. She still gives them like that, oh, there's still the hope of being able to come back, which is really powerful and somewhat terrifying as like a way of getting people to do what you want, I guess.
Yeah, I completely agree. And of course, America does explicitly tell all of them that they will die
Yeah,
in
she does.
Lands of Fire before coming back to life too.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, it's interesting how From Software picks up, like, it creates these player characters as blank slates in general. It's always
Mhm.
nice how they get tied into the lore.
It is. And I think it's also really nice in the way of the like base classes having that like entirely woven in, with also all of the base presets having that woven in as well. Like you're not just a random person. You're a samurai who has a Newman like bloodline, right? You're a confessor who's got a draconian bloodline, that kind of thing. And then being able to create all of those things in between while still having like that little bit of like that little dumpling of lore at the very beginning to be like, you're not just like some random person. You did have a genealogy, even if you don't know it, and even if the character wouldn't know it at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just love the lore it gives. The fact that Newman are humans, the fact
Mhm.
that the Night Folk bleed silver, similarly to the Mimic Tears, or no, thought to bleed silver long ago, I think is what
Mhm.
it
Yeah,
says. The Draconians existing at all is just intensely
yeah.
fascinating.
I think that's also one of those rabbit holes where just the existence of the Draconians is just like a what?
They're all
Because
Vike's children, actually.
yeah, I mean, maybe Godfrey and Fortisax. I don't Godwin.
Godwin and
Wait,
Fortisax.
wrong one. um, ugh, um, hey, maybe Plassey was just getting it on. Who knows?
Yeah, Plassey and Godfrey hate fucked before the final duel. That's canon now. I said
It's
so.
canon. Okay. The thread's getting a little bit out, a little bit frayed. We should get back. Um,
I think it tore actually.
oh, the
So
thread of
let's
fate.
get into the adversaries to the
Mhm.
Tarnished. When we get to the lands between, we are met by a lot of people that hate us. They call us foul tarnished and all other sorts of mean things. So the lands between it's ruled by demigods and other legends. Like when we go there, each biome is ruled by its own demigod hero who became a shard bearer during the Shattering War and has ruled since then essentially.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of interesting things to get into because like even just the status of being a demigod, as the common people know it, it's just a status symbol because if you look at Rykard or Radahn, they're technically demigods because they married into the royal family or
Mhm.
like when Radigan married Marika to the common people, that made, Radahn, Rani, and Rykard all
Yeah.
demigods.
Yeah.
But in reality, they were always demigods because Radigan and Marika were one and the same.
Mhm.
That's another rabbit hole to get into. I like to think that they are always one and the same,
Mhm.
as my personal view on it, but obviously that has its own nuance.
Honestly, I kind of flip back and forth between those options because I think like both of them have so much merit at this current point. Whether like they were always the same or whether they only like joined together later, because they really have different vibes, I guess, and it's really hard to like have actual concrete evidence as to which is true, I suppose.
There's no full indication of either or. Maybe we'll learn something from the DLC though.
Maybe we
Have you
will.
seen the people brain rotting over Marika's chest in the most recent
Oh,
trailer?
yes, I have seen a lot of that
It
already.
has to be Radigan because she has no booba,
Yeah.
regardless of the fact that she's facing away from the camera.
Yeah, regardless of the fact that this is a trailer of a Peggy 16 game that is released onto YouTube, so even if they wanted to, they probably couldn't. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
regardless also of the fact that it's very, very clear that like they want you to be confused as to thinking whether this is Marika or it's Mikola, because they want you to see those characters as very similar in certain ways, but also we're meant to hate Marika but not hate Mikola, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
we can also ignore that, I suppose. Has to be Radagon.
It has to be
Um,
Radigan. Couldn't be
no,
anyone
but
else.
I think like that goes into a whole like another like thread of how like this game really does have like a lot of themes of masculine and feminine traits like for things being like important but also interwoven with each other, and how like Marika and Radagon are both characters who have those traits and therefore and also are the same person, right? And so those things like Marika having masculine traits doesn't necessarily mean she's not Marika, right? And I think that's yeah.
Yeah, like America is associated with smithing, while Radigan's associated with sewing, despite
Mhm.
them embodying the typical like the masculine is strong and the feminine is mentally oriented.
Mhm.
And that's not even to get into some of the many other examples that From Software uses to try and like they play into the thematic coding of masculine and feminine, but then they
Mhm.
also use that same thematic coding to upend what they've already said. Like we
Yeah.
see that Radigan represents the masculinity in the relationship between the gods.
Mhm.
But then we also see that their daughter, Millennia, who is a woman, is the most powerful warrior of the demigod caste, and is the only one of them to fully embody Godfrey's, like, basically war undefeated status during his
Yeah.
old war, because Millennia is technically undefeated since it was just a stalemate with Radahn.
Mhm.
And you see that like strength in Millennia as opposed to Rykard or Radahn or Godrek, who all also try to imitate Godfrey to varying levels of success.
Mhm. Um, and I think also the idea of the land being ruled by these demigods is almost like it is accurate, but it's also similarly like some level of like obfuscation in a way where in it like all of those demigods obviously ruled over their respective lands at some point, but I think I could pretty happily blanket statement say that none of them are actively ruling at this point in a way that is a lot like is them like ruling, if that makes sense. Even the ones who we could consider are ruling a lot more like actively, like Godric and Morgott, they have reasons in which they can't rule in the same way that they potentially would have, or other demigods would have in the past.
Hmm.
Pretty much every single demigod in the game has a reason to not be outwardly facing ruling, and therefore a lot of their like followers are almost chasing after images in a way of like following the like rules and statements and like beliefs of other people from like times long past at this point.
Yeah. No, I totally get that. Um, like the demigods can barely even rule themselves.
Hmm.
Like you say, like they're sheltered away, they're secluded. Elden Ring, the lands between, represents a post-apocalyptic landscape where any previous governance has been shattered. Like you say, the closest that we get to actual rulership is, is probably Limgrave, uh, the Altus Plateau, the Halig Tree,
Hmm.
and maybe that little fire monk outpost on the mountain top, because those guys are thriving up there. They love
Yeah.
the flame. They're just chilling, straight chilling. Uh, but like Godric, he doesn't rule anything. He doesn't like manage taxes. Like the only times he probably leaves Stormvale, if he ever does at all, is to go on tarnished hunts. Like
Hmm.
he's a warlord. He's barely a lord.
He's a bandit king at best.
Yeah. Morgot can't fix things because he can't show himself to the people
Yeah.
of the city. We don't have the cut Shane Height quest line anymore, but that
No.
would have more clearly indicated that the soldiers of the city who obey the nobles who are unseen and maybe dead in this iteration of the game, since the Shane Height quest line had the Shane Height guy appear as being dead with a war caravan and the Serpent's Pass secret entrance to the Altus Plateau.
Hmm.
Um, but if that's the case, then we see how Morgott controls his human soldiers by keeping it secret that he's not human, which you
Hmm.
get from the Veiled King monomer, of course.
Yeah. And then you've also got like Radahn and Rykard, who again, like other people are either ruling in their absence or they're just more like myths of people and are like things to follow more than anything. Like
I think
Radahn's,
Radahn's army maintained
Mhm.
a really impressive amount of cohesion in
Yeah.
being able to not only protect Caelid and erect the smoldering walls at the Limgrave border and at the Dragonbarrow border, but
Mhm.
they were also able to actively go hunting the beasts of the wild, like as you see when you approach Redmane Castle. And on top of that, they were able to set a garrison at the Divine Tower to protect it, which, like, Jaren's doing a pretty stand-up job. Bro is
Yes,
bro
yeah.
is thriving.
But at the same time, like, it is still Radahn who's believed to be ruling in a way, if that makes sense. Where, like, obviously it is Jaren who is doing all of the actual, like, busy work, but Radahn's the one with the rune, and Radahn's like the name you hear constantly during that.
He's the
Um,
legitimacy.
yeah, exactly. Um,
Hmm.
and it is really, really interesting, I think, the fact that all of those things are the case because, oh my god, I'm gonna get to say the thing. All of these, like, individuals were ruined by the shattering. They were literally shattered, just as much as Marika and Radagon were, just as much as the Elden Ring was, just as much as the Lands Between itself was. And I think, again, it goes into that, like, wordplay to some extent where the word shattering and how that manifests, it's not just the act of shattering the Elden Ring. It's not just the war. It is a descriptor for each and every person who was affected by it. Um, and like literally every single character, every single demigod has been like unable to do their duty to their people because the war has affected them in a way, or they have been like coerced like into the war to some extent because Marika said, "All of you demigods, either die in obscurity or make a name for yourself," and so they all scrambled to try and make a name for themselves.
War makes monsters of us all. And it's not just the war, too. Like, if you look at the intro cutscene again, it specifically mentions that these demigods were tainted by the strength of their runes. Like, these people took in metaphysical shards of the entity that governs the cosmic threads of reality, and they
Mm.
used these shards, these great runes, to give themselves great power, just like the player does. But I feel like it stands to reason that these shards, that these cosmic powers, would taint and corrupt their mindset over time.
Mhm.
Like, I think that you could really just, like, I think you could. I've done this before multiple times
Yeah.
on Reddit, I guess, but bear with me because I think it's a really fun thing to go through. But like, you can take all of the great runes and you can see how they impact their lords. Like, if
Mhm.
you look at Godric's great rune, it's the only great rune to graft other great runes onto itself.
Mhm.
That could be why he becomes so obsessed with grafting. That might be why he's able to graft a dragon head to his arm, where his previous the Godefroy, where Godefroy failed, where because he was like we know that grafting existed before Godric, but no one has ever grafted as well as Godric, and it would explain
Mhm.
his obsession if it's the Taint of the Great Rune.
And I think
Likewise, oh, go on.
Sorry, I was also going to say, and I think with Godric, it's even more interesting to then consider the fact that his Great Rune being that center one where all of the other ones coincide. Uh, his Great Rune, what the section that's not like actually covered by the other ones in a way, or wouldn't be covered by the other ones, is the smallest. And he, as an individual, is the smallest and the weakest, and so he has to functionally pull on the strength of other beings in order to make himself seem bigger, um, be stronger, be able to do all of these things.
I love that reading, and it fits with how you see his broken corpse after the battle, where it's just the
Mhm.
head and torso.
100%. But yeah,
Yeah.
continue with the other demigods, please.
Of course. So I mean, Morgott is one of my favorites. If you look at Morgott's, his is the central line of the Elden Ring, and it's said to be like the purest, and it's said to indicate that he is the direct lineage of Godfrey. Like this rune proves it. And I like to think that because of the purity of the rune, that this is what lets him recant his accursed blood. Like, if you could just recant your Omen blood, I feel like he would have done that way long ago. But if there was
Mhm.
some sort of block to the power, if he was not able to do it without the help of a Great Rune, then I think that adds a lot more value to what happens, and it explains why he wouldn't do it until then. With Radahn, we see a picture of him fighting Morgott in
Mhm.
one of the intro cutscenes, and then later on, he's way bigger. If his Great Rune made him grow in size, that stands to reason. It also fits with the fact that his Great Rune burns to resist the smoldering, the Scarlet Rot.
Mhm.
This could be seen as simply Radon, casting his own magic on himself, his own willpower to resist the rot. But there's a secondary thing to the taint of these great runes. If you look at Dark Souls 2, you have what's called you've got these Lord Souls. You have to kill 4 bosses, and in killing the 4 bosses, you unlock, the end game pathway. That's the same thing that Dark Souls 1 does. And Dark Souls 2 reuses the concept, the 4 archetypes of those Dark Souls 1 bosses for its Dark Souls 2 bosses. And I think that Elden Ring might be going for a similar thing that Dark Souls 2 goes, where those archetypes are repeated because the souls of the original Great Ones from Dark Souls 1 are so ineffably powerful that they maintain their identity and integrity over eons of time. And it makes it so that anyone who takes up these souls is then impacted by them. So if you
Mhm.
look at Dark Souls 2 The Rotten, it is reminiscent of Nito from Dark Souls 1 because it has his soul. In that same way, if Radahn were to have grown bigger and his rune were to have been on fire, it could stand to reason that he has a rune from the fire giants. Like, if the
Mm.
great runes of the Elden Ring are taken from the different peoples of the lands between, if we look at Roger talking about how the Elden Ring was malleable during the beginning and how it added to itself,
Mhm.
obviously, I am pulling the tapestry to bits by explaining
Oh
this,
yeah.
but it's so cool to me that you can have these minor connections and that they can go that deep. I don't even know if I fully believe this stuff, but the idea that
Mhm.
Godric's rune might have been Placidusax's, the idea that
Makes a lot of
Morgott's
sense.
rune might have been Godfrey's, the idea
Mhm.
that Radahn might have the Fell Gods or another fire giants.
Mhm.
Rykard could have the Great Serpents, and that would explain his covetousness and greed. Like, there's so many threads that just work, and I
Mhm.
really like that.
It goes
Not
even
to spend too
further
much time.
with like Melania's rune being the god of rots and Moog's rune potentially being connected to the Formless Mother. Um, and like all of those things are like they all exist, and then on top of all of that, you've got the fact that Marika's rune, which spoilers, that's the thing that she during the story trailer that was just released, the way she, like the individual at the very beginning after taking something from what looks like an eye of something, we don't need to go too much into that, proceeds to stand in front of something very fleshy and concerning, holding the threads up above their head. And that is Marika's rune. Like, if you were to draw over that individual and the threads, it makes Marika's rune, which is at the very top of the Elden Ring. And it is literally just all of these demigods have taken all of these different sections from below, but Marika above is like life, the original like sprouter of all of these all the life and everything. But now that she's gone, all of that's left the lands between, or at least has been like hidden away in the Erdtree. But then also even more twofold, it's exactly the way she's crucified as well. Her own strength originally became her the method of her being contained. And
Yeah.
it's God,
And
this
if
game
you
is
want to
powerful.
see it from a literal sense, that could simply be one of her duties to be within the Erdtree, that like the Elden Ring might function best when it is literally laid out in that physical manner, and that
Mhm.
her as the vessel of the Elden Ring might have to do something like that. Uh
Yeah,
yeah.
and then
Not to spend too much time here, but I'd like you to maybe you should wrap up your
yeah,
thoughts and we can
I'll
move
wrap up
on.
the last thought with just a final question. That then comes into the question of like the Empyreans and like how they are going to proceed to potentially be the next gods. The question then becomes, other than Rani, who kind of just like uses the power of the Elden Ring to potentially either like disperse the Elden Ring or just say, nah, I'm not going to deal with this. What was the expectation of them becoming the next gods? Would they had to have done the same thing, embody the Elden Ring in a way, perhaps even embody their own rune in that same way? And what
And
would that
maybe
have
that's
even
why
meant?
Ronnie hated the idea so much, like
Mm,
you see like to from an outside perspective, to be goddess seems like to have all the control, but there's a lot of popular media nowadays, Dune among them, that likes to explore the idea of leadership from being a prisoner to the needs of your people. So for
mm,
in Nerika's case, she might have been a prisoner to the needs of the metaphysics of reality. If she became goddess, she might have been pulled, just like how the demigods were by their individual shards, she might have been compelled to act in certain ways that might have chafed against her inner wishes.
Mm. And I mean, you can see it literally physically upon her, where she and Radagon are like basically fossilized. They are stone, and they like tink when you hit them. But during the story cutscene and during pretty much every other like glimpse we have of them, they look like flesh and blood.
Yeah, like whatever happened when she shattered the Elden Ring, I do not think it was a pleasant explosion to be around.
Definitely not.
Yeah. We talked about thing more to say about how man must serve God, about the subservience and the relationship between man and God.
Hmm. Um, I do have several thoughts on that, and I think it's really interesting the fact that there are multiple like outer gods that are considered and deemed like evil, even just by the community to some extent. Whereas in times past and in the historical um like lands between, those things weren't seen as bad, they were just seen as facts of life and parts of life, right? So it does have this like idea of going from polytheistic to monotheistic, and the greater will and Marika becoming the singular goddess over everything. But like the polytheism doesn't necessarily go away. It just is eclipsed almost by this like the monotheism that kind of takes over and takes hold, because Marika happened to be the one who had the strength between all of her like the people she was working with and then the Elden Ring itself to basically take control of everything over a long course of time. Um, and I think the idea of the Golden Order in and of itself being spawned after Destined Death was like shut away into Malekith's Black Blade. Like it's very interesting, this idea that like the Golden Order in its creation and in its like every time it's like brought up, everything to do with Marika, almost all of these things are just like them trying to squash other things that could get in the way of them, other gods and other beings who have like some amount of sway over the common folk. But additionally, on top of that, them trying to um, almost like prove their own legitimacy as they do so. We have
Yeah.
control over death. We are life. We are bigger than the sun. We like and even then, like it's one of those things, as like I mentioned earlier, when it came to the tarnished, it's almost seeded as this idea of you don't get to die unless I tell you you die, and then after you die, you come back.
Hmm. I feel like outside of that last part about whenever you die, I get to tell you when you come back, it echoes a lot of real world Christian history.
Mm-hmm.
Um, obviously they don't have powers of resurrection or a cool ass tree. Maybe I'd be Christian if they had a cool ass tree in Rome.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but
I
it
mean,
does.
if you think about Jesus, he did have cool ass powers of resurrection, so we'll give him that.
Okay, he only used them on himself though, and one time. So,
Yeah,
do
yeah,
better, buddy. I'm sorry for any Christians watching this.
yeah. You are very valid. But in order, very specifically, just to clarify, when we like do talk about Christianity and other religions, we don't mean it in an offensive way. Obviously, your beliefs are not only just like completely fair and valid, but like in the historical sense, we are basically intellectualizing it in a way that isn't uh very conducive for like those kind of conversations. We are basically just saying like these are the ways they relate to Elden Ring, and we're going to take a very like Elden Ring pessimistic point of view in order to kind of rip apart like kind of pull apart the tapestry of Elden Ring to see where these inspiration came from. That doesn't necessarily mean that we think or at least I think, I can't speak for you, that your like opinions and thoughts are invalid or anything of the such.
Faith. I think faith is one of the most beautiful things that humans can do. It's very
100%.
pure, very ardently powerful. It's also very terrifying. But
It
I
is.
have a lot of respect for faith and religion.
Mhm.
When I'm not making fun of it. Apologies again. Um, But to get into like why we brought up Christian mythology is
Mhm.
there's a lot of phases to Christianity. Like they were spread through the Roman Empire as, first it like basically in at first in the Roman Empire, Christianity was basically adopted as like a slave religion. It was generally the lower
Mhm.
classes that followed it. It was rebellion groups. Jesus himself would have been something akin to like a rebellion leader, revolutionary, who would have lived at the time in hiding. This is why he had to be sold out in the first place by Judas, and he would have spread his teachings, going around.
Mhm.
Like you look at the historical theses about how like there's different prophets from the time that could have various acts attributed to Jesus. I don't know. I'm not a historian. I can't get into that though.
Mhm. Same.
But what we can get into is that Constantine, he adopts Christianity. He spreads it throughout the empire as a more legitimate faith. And then after the collapse of the Romans, their culture and religion sticks around for around 100-ish years before the culture fades away, but the religion remains.
Mm.
And in the new found stakes of the religion, they find they don't have a state representing them anymore. So they begin to, it's called syncretism, when a religion relates to another religion. It's that tolerance and acceptance and the similarities between the mythos that they share.
Mhm.
And when you become syncretic with another religion, sometimes that's a willfully done choice. So, like what Christianity did was they existed alongside all of these local cultures that the Romans had conquered, that they were now integrating with, and they saw these different like myths, and they did them into Christianity. If you look at a lot of Irish myths, you'll see what are a lot of hero kings and wizards and stuff. These
Mhm.
people were originally more akin to gods under the Irish myths. But in their acceptance into um, Christianity, they became heroes because, like, Christianity doesn't want gods, but it can accept saints. It can accept
Yeah.
people of magical power, but not, higher power.
Mhm.
So,
And I
yeah,
and I
go
was
on.
going to say, and I think like historically, it's also very interesting to see the differences in like most of the heroes that I can think of from Greek and even like Roman myths, and a lot of like some of the like smaller Egyptian myths and stuff like that as well. They were considered literal demigods, right? Like, in order for like Theseus to exist, people needed to give him like that demigod status, and so in some of the myths, I think in like a myth or two, he might be the son of Zeus, but generally he's accepted as like a son of Poseidon. Um, and like that exists through all of those, but then obviously, yeah, as you're mentioning in like the Irish like stuff there, it turns into heroes in order to like basically become legitimized and also just kind of find its way in line with Christianity in a way that satisfies both parties. It's not in like a kind of strange way. It's like improv terms. It's not really like them saying no, you can't do that. It's no, but they were still someone who was like relevant. You can still like do the thing that we're telling you to do and not like go against what you originally believed. We're just giving you slightly different words for it, really.
Yeah. And the fucked up aftermath to that is that they were never as accepting as they might have wanted to seem, and eventually these labels of heroes becomes labels of demons and whatnot, and
Mhm.
the acceptance becomes more rigid as years go on. And you see that in Elden Ring too. You see how, again, going back to Roger and the malleability of the Elden Ring in the early days of Godfrey's conquests, it accepted things. It accepted new faiths, new ideas. But
Mhm.
once the lands between were conquered, once there was nothing more to accept, it became rigid and unchanging. And you see that in the codification of Christian law. Like late stage Christianity, way past this point of being syncretic with other religions, most of their heresies, most of their inquisitions
Mhm.
were committed against themselves. Like the most heretical Christian was another fucking Christian, and they'd be constantly one upping each other. They'd be doing terrible things to each other.
Mhm.
Of course,
And
you
I
do have inquisitions that get caught up with other cultures. Spain is extremely guilty of it. Fucking Spain. First, they have Christopher Columbus, the Spanish Inquisition. They get up to shit. I mean, everyone gets up to shit. Nation
Yeah.
states are evil, but like, um,
Yeah. and we have like a good few examples of similar sort of things happening in Elden Ring. I think the two examples that come into my mind are like the dragon cults to some extent, where they had a war against the dragons, they made peace with the dragons, they brought draconic culture into their being, but then also like the eventually like it's not one to one in this case, but the dragon communion and the churches of like eating dragon hearts became a thing, right? Where eventually there was some level of like animosity that was still there. But I think an even better example is well, maybe not exactly better example, because there's not necessarily proof that they were accepted during the time of the Golden Order at all. But the Omen and the Crucible is a good example of how like they're technically still allowed to live under the Golden Order, but then the Omen killers exist, and like the Misbegotten and their Crucible examples, they basically got turned into slaves. Pretty much like everywhere you see them, they're either slaves or they're hidden away in their caves. And I think that's like specifically really interesting as like because the Misbegotten are really related to like Radagon as well. And seeing something like things that are like very like some like are pretty connected to Radagon then being entirely like shunned in a lot of ways, to the point where the only way that they really get their own like strength is rebelling in different places. It's pretty rough.
It's very dark. Elden Ring's very dark fantasy.
Mhm.
I like the idea of slave races that are condemned for the circumstances of their birth is very dark. And it does use a very powerful way of integrating this lore with other previous mentioned stuff. Like the Erdtree used to be the Crucible, and it was the Crucible that was worshipped during the prehistory. A lot of its signs of evolution were seen as signs of divinity. But in the transition from the Crucible to the Erdtree, like in that same transition from polytheism around the Crucible to monotheism around the Erdtree, you see this stigma against these evolutionary signifiers of divinity. You see them begin to be seen as pre-evolution things rather than like higher evolution. And because of this, the humans get a excuse, to stigmatize the misbegotten and enslave them. Likewise with the Omen, it's a very similar thing, but some of the stigma is more akin to like vilifying the Omen by circumstances of their birth rather than by circumstances of. It's similar. It's basically the same thing, but I feel like there's a little bit of nuance difference between
Mhm.
them, just like in the history of how both peoples were taken, I
Yeah.
guess. There's a further interesting thing. I don't know if you remember this quote, but
Mhm.
there's a noble in Castle Morn. His
Mm.
ghost is like, "No, don't eat me, or I'll become one of you," or something like that.
Yeah.
Which I think it's interesting because if you look at eating as consuming as like the frenzied flame soldiers do the same thing. They eat to
Mhm.
take what is outside of them into them and make it like them. So
Mhm.
in that same way, whatever fire, energy, life forces inside of the Misbegotten is not only something that is powerful enough to overtake what the Erdtree intends, but
Mhm.
it's also enough to change what the Erdtree like if this is true, if that guy actually will become a
Yeah.
Misbegotten by being eaten.
And I think honestly it could be, considering like the frenzied flame soldiers are like the ones we see eating people are on Mount Gelmir, and then on top of that you see that Rykard was doing research into the frenzied flame at some point, because you can see that like the Albinoric hats are there to induce basically frenzied flame. They're there to induce like the great amounts of despair in order for him to keep torturing them and try and potentially research like those effects. And then Rykard turns into a giant snake who's like gets eaten by a giant snake, becomes part of it, and then eats a bunch of other people in
To
order to
make them
bring
part of
part of him.
himself.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But also on the complete other end of that, you've got oh my god, I've forgotten his name. Shit Stain McGee. I don't know why I wanted to call him that. With the poop ending.
Oh,
Um,
Dung Eater.
Dung Eater, exactly. Where very like specifically he's eating. I forget what it's actually called, but there's a mythological like organ that exists in basically the butthole. of people in like Japanese myths, right? Where like certain demons would just like pull it out of you and eat it and then curse you for all time because of it, right?
There's a myth. Part of that myth, I think, has to do with that being where your soul is stored in the
Yeah,
body. This is also why the headless and Sekiro have the anal fisting grab attack.
yeah. Um, but like the idea basically for Dung Eater's ending is that by him eating people and like causing the seedbed curse within them, when they come back, if they come back, they will have the omen curse. Um,
Mm-hmm.
because he's a strange individual as it is, but like in a way he's right. And while it's the whole like Incredibles line of if everybody is a super, nobody's a super. If everybody's an omen, then we just go back to like things being like normal. You can't if you're all the same, you can't technically like have physical reasons to uh like hate each other, which isn't necessarily true. But because like that doesn't necessarily mean like the omen traits aren't like stronger or weaker or whatever. But I think there definitely is a level of like in Elden Ring, this idea of being consumed, meaning that like in future cycles, if things continue, that you are going to be a part of that, or you'll become either a part of that misbegotten or like literally being remade as a misbegotten because you've passed through them, you've got some of their traits at this point, and then therefore when you're reborn, uh, you'll be more like them.
Mm-hmm. And if you take
Uh,
this to the logical extreme,
mhm.
the thing that is eating everyone is the Erdtree. If
Yeah.
the practice of Erdtree burial and any sort of burial is that you're buried and the Erdtree's roots absorb your nutrients back into the network and absorb your soul back into the metaphysics of the tree, and it performs whatever cleansing properties it intends to before rebirthing you in the land. One of the issues with this is that what we learn at the end of the game from Gideon and also somewhat from Vere much earlier is that the two fingers and the three fingers are broken implicitly, as is
Mhm.
the Erdtree. All was broken long ago at the genesis of the Golden Order, and that has made the Erdtree imperfect. And that imperfection spreads to every corner of existence. Like the
Mm.
Omen are almost certainly born because of this imperfect like rebirthing process. They're even said to be haunted by elder ghosts, like dark spirits that are angry.
Mhm.
um, the idea that these spirits are called elder, as in to indicate that they're from before the Golden Order, especially since you see them in like the mountaintop of giants. I think
Mhm.
I'm sort of going off of the imps. They have the elder mask. You
Yeah.
see the elder mask version of the imps most commonly, I think, in the mountaintops, and I think it indicates that there is an angry group of people from before the Golden Order who still have enough resentment to be cursing it, and
Mhm.
that you can be cursed into becoming not an elder, but becoming another cursed spirit just like them. The cursed spirits, just to clarify, if you look at the corrupted bell summoners that are in like Liurnia or the Shaded Castle or the Halig Tree that summon the little rotten spirits. Those are the dark spirits. You can compare those to the more typically pure ones from the necromancy spells that Garrus has. Those are just typical spirits. And then you can further compare those to like Rykard's red spirits, which I'm
Mm.
assuming are spirits that he's absorbed and that now carry part of his power and that like are beholden to him or something like
Mhm.
that.
Um, and like this, continuing on that spirit trend, also the Omen Killer mask is very specifically there to taunt the Omen about those spirits by itself. It's meant to mimic those spirits and the
Mm-hmm.
horror of it, which is even more terrifying. But like, I wanted to also just quickly talk about like the mechanics of how the Erdtree is broken and how the genesis of the Golden Order is the problem with it. Where the genesis of the Golden Order is like it's 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 still a little bit iffy, but like it's pretty well established through I think it's a description for Malekith's Blackblade that mentions it. But destined death being sealed away was when the Golden Order itself was a thing, like when it probably first came
I
about.
think that's Enya's dialogue. She talks
Ah,
about it as
yeah,
being like the cornerstone of the order.
yeah. but like Malekith's Blackblade, therefore destined death, and the cleansing flame of death in itself, is like a part of the process of, I think, like the way I see it, of how you would be cleansed by the Erdtree and then still be able to be rebirthed anew, fresh, right? Like we've talked about how flame is like both death and rebirth. But like taking that entire aspect out of the process means that you're not like whatever process the tree is doing in and of itself isn't complete. There is a step that's missing. There is a cleansing flame that's meant to burn away something that isn't there. And so therefore the Erdtree, obviously there's like other ways it's flawed. It's not just because Death and Death is gone. But by having no Death and Death, it becomes even more broken in a way. Like the process of life continuing like doesn't work in the same way. And like you can see that as well because like there are like hints that births have been decreasing and people have been living way longer than they really should have in ways that aren't really very conducive to life. And yeah, I mean, don't know what else to really say about that. That's just really, that sucks.
Uh-huh. No, I get you. It's a good ramble.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how much I have to respond. I feel like I was formulating something and then
Yeah.
lost it, you know, type of things.
It's how the tapestry goes. Sometimes pulling the thread means that like you just don't know where else to go with it.
Yeah. I think one thing, I guess one final thing, is that like I think infinity is an unattainable concept.
Yeah.
That's a very common media trope. That's an easy thematic idea to embrace that immortality is inherently unattainable. And I think that Soulsborne does it very classically. Like every age that was supposed to last forever doesn't. You know, it's a very easy way to tell on the fact that eternity is not what it seems. If you take that one step further, if you look at gold as immortal, as infinite, as supposedly pure, then you see an older version of gold. You see red gold, primordial gold. This is represented in Ordovis's sword,
Mm.
who is the captain of the Crucible Knights, well, one of them. There's also Sileria. And you also see the red gold on, I think, like one of the great shields. It's referenced again. And what's interesting about this red gold, this primordial gold, is that red also represents destined death, and that's like that secret ingredient you were talking about. I don't know if there's any permanent, perfect rebirth process that could be achieved through the Erdtree. I think that Elden Ring likes to present it like it was a dream that could have been, that maybe the Age of Plenty could have been forever, that maybe we could still make the Erdtree work, but it'll never be as perfect as we want it. Um,
Mm.
but there's this also, like if you look at Placidusax as representing red gold and him existing before the cycle of birth and death and being just beyond all of that, then you see eternity not in life, but in deathless life. Like
Mm.
Placidusax is a rock, you know? I mean, when it comes down to it, like if death and life, death and immortality have to be combined for true immortality, primordial gold to exist. And that current gold is just like an imitation of that that doesn't work because the death is removed. I don't
Mm.
know. That goes way too far. That's like tearing apart the tapestry. I bring it up though because if we look at the latest DLC story trailer, just to have a little bit of tie-in into recent events in this,
Ooh.
like at the end of our podcast episode, we see, you know, there was the seduction and the betrayal, an
Mm.
affair from which gold arose and from which also shadow was born. Um, it's interesting because obviously if primordial gold existed, did it exist before this birth of gold? Is this
Mm.
birth of gold specifying America's gold?
I think
It's interesting.
it is specifying Mariska's gold, and I think very importantly, like I've done a lot of research into like the actual physical, real life mechanics of different types of gold and like colored gold and stuff like that. And usually, red gold refers to an alloy of I think it's either copper or there's something else sometimes where like you have gold alloyed with copper. We're going to just go with copper in this case, where it tends to be a lot stronger because gold as like an actual material is pretty soft,
Hmm.
and it's pretty easily like tarnished, right? Like, whereas like alloys tend to be a lot stronger because you mix the gold with other things and then it like bonds a lot better with other things than just itself. Um, and I think it's really interesting where like this is a whole nother tapestry to talk about, which maybe we'll get onto it next time. I think there's way too much to talk about right now. Um, is how like the differences in the different types of gold throughout the history of the lands between starts with being more alloyed, coming down all the way down to Mikola and unalloyed gold specifically, where Mikola's unalloyed gold is just a statement on like saying Marika, the gold that you created is still unpure. It can be tarnished, as the players are tarnished. It can be ruined, and it's not as pure as it could be. But
It's taken
in
in the influence of other great runes. It's subject to the wills of outer gods. It's not as
exactly,
yeah.
um, and in doing so, because it doesn't like intentionally become stronger by alloying itself properly with those things, it becomes weaker and it is crushed by it. Um, and the interesting thing as well though is that Mikola's unalloyed gold isn't perfect, and unalloyed like gold in real life is really soft. It's really malleable. It has, if I remember correctly, a pretty low melting point. And it is just unfit to be used for most purposes because you can literally just crush it with your hands. And so I think that like also plays into the fragility of Mikola and Melania to some extent as well, where even though she's the strongest warrior, she's literally fragile in the fact that she's killing herself by existing. And Mikola is the weakest seeming physical of the demigods, and yet when we hear the trailer, kindly Mikola uh, divested himself of his strength, of his fate to come to the Shadowlands. And I think, like, at least from my point of view, leaving on that idea of if Mikola had this strength and yet was still this soft, malleable gold and created all of that, what does that mean for Elden Ring? What does that mean for the lands between? What does that mean for us going into the DLC? Uh, how does him losing the strength he had, this unsurmountable seeming strength, according to the narrator, um, like what is the difference there between the golds that were created before the Golden Order and then the Golden Order itself?
Yeah. I'm very curious, and I hope we find out more in the DLC.
I'm so excited.
I am too. I think this will be it for this episode. We've covered a lot of ground. I think next time, if you liked this episode, we'll be talking about our Empyrean guides throughout the game. Ronnie, Melina, and eventually in the DLC, Mikola. But that'll have to wait until next time.
This is where the fun begins.
I Yeah, thank you so much for joining though, Rage. I had a ton of fun. Are there any closing statements you'd like to share with the class?
No, I mean it was a pleasure. I'm really enjoying this. Had a lot of fun, and it's also really funny just in the fact that a lot of my research is like so hyper focused on certain things that like a lot of these things like you point them out, and I'm like, it's been 2+ years, and like I have now like new thoughts on Elden Ring because of what you've said. But like we've been talking about Elden Ring this entire time, and yet still I find ways to go, oh my god, there's still more. Oh, there's still more. That's crazy.
Yeah, it's never ending. Like, yeah, it's crazy. Even if you could compile all the information about Elden Ring from all of the different people, like there's so many different people that all have their own takes.
Yep.
There's never like you can never know everything. It's crazy.
Hmm.
Not to mention
And
the fact that you just forget. I like this series because I'm trying to remember everything myself before we
yep.
get into the DLC. Gotta brush up on the lore. So, leave
Yeah.
your comments, concerns, questions below. If there's any questions, I can probably answer them at the end of the future episode. I
Hmm.
love to hear feedback. I love to hear other lore theories. Like, I'd
Oh
love to
yeah.
put them in a video. Yeah. Rage Akari, where can you explain some of your YouTube channel? Is there any socials or upcoming projects you want to shout out?
Well, Yeah, just Rage Akari on YouTube and Twitter and all of the other places where you can usually find people. And yeah, I've got like 2 or 3 things cooking all at the same time because I can't ever stick to one. The soonest, hopefully, thing, the soonest thing that should be done reasonably is I've been starting an Elden Ring iceberg, but obviously in doing so, I realized, oh, I like being thorough, and then had to cut it up into hundreds upon hundreds of pieces in order to be thorough enough that all of these things are given like their due. So the first of those episodes should be coming out hopefully somewhat soon. And then other than that, I'm sure I'm just going to be streaming parts of the DLC. I'm going to be talking about the DLC a bunch. And so we'll see.
Yep, we shall. So yeah, thank you again for joining, and don't you dare go hollow on me. Goodbye.
Goodbye.